Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. This is Jim Cunningham. Welcome back to Faith Influencer. This is our podcast for blended families. We talk about everything blended families. You know what's funny about that is we're still a fairly new podcast, just about 5 months into this thing. I'm so excited about the responses that we get in the comments. As a matter of fact, some of my podcasts are a direct response from the comments that we get. And maybe the most surprising thing to me in doing this podcast are what turns out to be the hot topics that you want to respond to. I perhaps could have predicted that the topic on you shouldn't marry that guy was a hot topic. I didn't predict that the one on Granny's Too Nosy was going to be a hot topic, but I guess that's a real deal for many of you, and you commented on that. So I appreciate your responses. I appreciate you following. Today, we're going to talk about a dreaded word that we all hate, and it's that word compromise. As a matter of fact, I don't get upset when I get my way. It's that compromising thing, right? That's how a lot of people feel. I want to say that it is a biblical concept right at the beginning because Paul said in Philippians, not to look at your own interest, but each of you look after the interest of others. So it is a biblical concept that we should consider others before ourselves, but it's a difficult thing when you look at what you must compromise in blended families. It's a whole different set of things that we must juggle that traditional families don't understand. So let's talk about one in particular. Let's talk about when you join your families together and each of you are bringing certain traditions and things that you did in your previous life into this new one. And now you've got to decide which direction to go. I'll tell you that my wife and I had to deal with some of this. Here's a silly one that we had to deal with. It was a real issue for me. I guess it was a real issue for her. Maybe she was better at this thing than I was because she ended up getting her way, but it had to do with our little dog sleeping in the bed or not. Now, I was raised from my dad, who is sort of the large and in charge kind of husband and father, okay? And he was, dogs don't sleep in the bed with you. Well, my wife was raised totally different, and the little dog absolutely sleeps in the bed with us. So guess who won that one? Well, he sleeps in the bed. So maybe that tells you who won that argument. I ended up compromising, but here was the compromise. Okay, I know this is important to you because the little dog is like a kid to you. So if he's going to be one of your children, he's not one of my children. This is the little joke we go back and forth. So if he's going to sleep in bed, he's got to sleep on your side. So that's how we fix that. She said, absolutely. So he doesn't sleep in between us. He sleeps on her side. Okay, that was the compromise. In the bed, her side. We figured it out. But you're probably dealing with some stuff that you haven't figured out yet. As a matter of fact, here's how crazy this topic is. I sat down last night and I told my wife, I said, here's what I'm going to talk about in the podcast as we record this. I want to talk about family traditions. And so I started talking about Christmas, and I'm going to get into this a little deeper with you. But as I was talking about Christmas, I was talking about some of the Christmas traditions that I had growing up, and then I had in a previous marriage, and some of the traditions that she had in her previous marriage, and they were total opposites. And as we're discussing this, she goes on this discussion where she's proving to me why her tradition is better. And then we start laughing because this is exactly what I'm talking about when you bring these traditions in. So for me, was your tradition anything like mine? My tradition is that all the family gathered together at my grandmother's house. Even after I was married and had children, everybody loaded up and went to Christmas at Granny's house. And we all piled in the living room, and everybody had their presents in front of them. And whenever we were given the word, it was a free-for-all. Everybody ripped open their gifts all at the same time. It was laughter and loud, and the parents were watching their kids and all of this, and paper was flying everywhere, and it was a lot of fun. And I told my wife about that when we got married, because I didn't think about bringing traditions into our marriage until after we were married. So I'm helping you here. If you haven't remarried yet, you need to talk about this one, because she thought that was the worst thing she'd ever heard of. She thought, how was that enjoyable? I'm like, well, what's your tradition? And she said, our tradition is, first of all, I want to have Christmas just with our kids. I want to have our own private Christmas just with them. We can have the family Christmas later, but I want to have our own just with our kids. And said, okay, so how do you want to do it? She wants to set all the kids in a circle and hand out all the gifts, and each kid have their pile of gifts. And then one by one, now I'd rather blow my foot off than do this, but I'm listening to her. One by one, this kid opens their gift. We take pictures, they smile, and then we go to the next kid and they open their, and we just follow this. And it's an all day thing. Everybody opens 2 or 3 gifts as we go in order, and then we take a break. And we go and eat breakfast, and we cook this breakfast and everybody eats. And then after an hour or so, we all come back to the gifts and we sit down, and one by one, we continue the process, take a break. That was the tradition. I thought that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard of. So what do you do when you have the free-for-all tradition and the very organized, dreadful tradition? How do you combine those, or how do you decide which way to go? Well, some of you are like, yeah, I like your church. Some of you are like, no, your wife's right. That's how we do ours as well. How do you compromise? Well, that's a great question. And let's see if we can dig into it a little bit. So let me first say why I struggled personally with giving up some traditions. So my first marriage with my 2 daughters, we had our traditions, and I was married for a long time. And so our traditions were pretty ingrained. So like you, when I went through a divorce, I was filled with guilt. Most people are. I was filled with guilt. And one of those things I discovered later, as I went through some introspection and some counseling, was that it wasn't so much that the kids were struggling with changing our traditions. It was me feeling guilty about what I thought was taking something else from them. They didn't feel that way, but I was feeling that way. I also discovered that I was feeling a little nostalgic because I missed that from my previous life. But you know what you have to realize? That was a previous life. You're creating new traditions with your new family. So what do? Well, first of all, you begin to think about, how do we work through conflict? Now, this is a real conflict. How do we work through conflict, and how do we compromise? Well, here's some ideas for you. One, you need to appreciate, both you and your spouse, appreciate the idea that you were raised differently. That's okay. That you had previous relationships and marriages and you did things differently. That's okay. Doesn't mean one was bad and the other was good. Just appreciate that both of you come from different backgrounds. Maybe you came from different parenting styles, maybe different financial situations, maybe different emotional needs. But realize that's okay that you came from something different. Then you have to respect each other's views and each other's opinions. I was kidding when I say that my wife's view on Christmas was dreadful and awful. It's fine. We adapted much of that into how we do Christmas now. We have to respect each other's opinions. But here's the big one. So I want you to get ready for this one. Here's the big one. Forget the pride and the need to be right. Someone said a long time ago to me, they said, you want to be right or you want to be happy? Well, sometimes that's your choice. Sometimes we get so ingrained that the way we view it is right that we want to argue our point and prove to you that our way is the correct way and your way is not. Listen, your need to be right is prideful. It really is. And you know what that kind of prideful attitude does? It chips away at your relationship. Even if your spouse gives in because they don't want to argue about it, or you have a way to be more forceful, it chips away at the relationship. So what we do is we realize that there's this great word, compromise. And I want you to get this in your vocabulary right now. I want you to memorize this little sentence. Compromise is not weakness. Okay? Compromise is not a weakness. In fact, what you'll discover is that compromise becomes one of the strongest tools in your remarried toolbox. It becomes one of those tools that once you realize that compromise is a strength, not a weakness, the ability to see both sides and to give in, give and take, once you realize that that is a real part of growing in a relationship and having a strong relationship, then you're going to realize that it's not a bad thing. It's not a weakness. It's a strength. It's a strength. Having to have your way is not a strength. It's childish. It's childish. Some people just need to grow up in their relationships. Some people don't have to have their way all the time. Now, let me say one other thing. I've talked about this in a previous podcast, and it's still a real deal. I had a conversation literally yesterday about this very thing. I was talking to this couple, and he was saying how much they have issues with overcoming issues. And I said, so why are you see each other's point? What's the deal? We were talking about compromise. And what I found out is that the way they were discussing it was the problem. The way they were discussing it was their tone, and it got louder and louder, and it got more hostile. And the more their tone got hostile and louder, that approach only created distance, and no one was going to give in to the other person's idea. So let me give you a couple of last things here I want you to implement in your remarriage. So here we go. One, compromise is about embracing change. It's about embracing change. The hard part is that this is so emotional that you feel it. You feel it. You may have felt it even when you were married the first time because you grew up as a little kid with certain traditions and those kinds of things. We do the same thing with Thanksgiving. We have a tradition where all of my family gathers together the day after Thanksgiving. We have this big Mexican food meal. That's our Thanksgiving tradition. Well, it didn't interfere with her Thanksgiving day, so that worked out. But what if it did? Now, here's what happens. You feel this. You like how you've done it. We bring all of this together, but yet we're ready to embrace change. And then we drop this bomb. My child's other parent, they have that whole family now that you have to consider. And now here's what happens. Compromises not just with your spouse over those traditions, compromises with your ex-spouse and that they want to have the children as well. That really becomes difficult to juggle. You know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're like me, what happens is that each year you switch days that you have the kids. For example, you want the kids on Christmas. Well, so does your spouse. So next year you'll have to do it just the opposite. But compromise is not just with your spouse now. In those situations, you have to compromise with ex-spouses, and then you have other grandparents or your children do on that side. So you feel all of this, these emotional choices. So compromise is about embracing change, but I understand why it's hard because it's emotional. But here's what you're going to find. You're going to find that after time, as you begin to embrace these changes and you begin to embrace these new ideas and these new traditions, that you're going to come up with your own traditions, maybe a little bit of his, maybe a little bit of hers. And then you're going to bring your own into the mix, and you're going to find out that you have your own traditions that you cherish, that you've tweaked under the umbrella of compromise. Last thing I would say is include your kids. When I say include your kids, I mean it's the first step to healthy compromise is healthy communication. And the part about healthy communication that sometimes we miss out is including other people. I'm going to suggest that you include your kids. Ask your kids what they like. Ask them what was important to them. Ask them what's the most fun to them about Thanksgiving or about Halloween or about Christmas or whatever it is. Ask them what piece of that. And you may bring little pieces from each side that you didn't realize that they were loving the most. And you're including them in the conversation. And then you create, by mixing this all together, your own tradition. So that's the word for today, compromise. That's the assignment for all of us, is learn how to give and take. Thanks as always for joining us. Please share, please like, please tell others about this podcast, and we will see you next time. Thank you.